Thank you for joining me. I'm Nola Simon. I'm the host of the Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence, and today's topic really is the right to disconnect. And this type of legislation is popping up around the world. Ontario, Canada currently actually has it. It is happening in multiple different jurisdictions and countries. Currently, California is on the books, or is about to be on the books. It hasn't been passed. It's creating a lot of a debate, and I thought I would actually weigh in on it because the thing with legislation is it's really the last stop. You don't want to be the company who has your employees actually enforce the legislation. So the point is actually not the legislation. You want to actually change your behavior before the legislation would have to kick in. You don't want your employees to actually feel that they have to actually understand the legislation in order to affect change in their workload and how they actually work for you. And the legislation really is a deterrent to companies treating their employees like the legislation matters, right? You want to be respectful that people do have a life outside of work, whether the reason that they need to go home at a certain time during the day is because they have kids, whether they have elder care, whether they just have other things that they would rather be doing. The right to disconnect is recognizing that you have a life outside of work. And I would recommend that even if the legislation doesn't really affect you now, to start considering the workload that your employees actually have and the reasons why they work outside regular business hours or the expected hours you expect them to work, right? Because overwork, and I've done it personally, I have the story to highlight that. I had pneumonia, crashed my car, made 1 million people late for work. Yeah, and that was all related to overwork and working outside over hours. It has a cost, overwork. So you want to make sure that your employees are not putting themselves in a situation like I did, where I risked getting more ill and jeopardizing my family's experience of me, basically. It cost me my car. I was off work for 2 months. It impacted things that I was working on. I lost opportunities. There were all kinds of costs associated with that. And ultimately, it cost my relationship with that particular division, because when I asked to actually go remote because of the accident, I didn't want to actually be commuting because I thought I had a really good example of why even one day was too much. I was told no. And so I walked away because obviously the policy was worth more than my life. So overwork and workloads that are beyond the pale have a cost. And so you don't want to be the reason as a company that your employees are putting themselves in that position where they're risking their health, their life, their relationships, and that includes the relationship with you. So I would start individually tracking why people are overworking. So if you are an individual, start writing down what are the reasons why you actually overwork and how you could avoid that. So if it's because you're an expert on a certain piece and you're constantly overburdened with people coming to you and that's putting you behind another work, then maybe you start documenting the reasons why people come to you. Maybe you start building a database and recording the meetings that you have with people. Maybe if you've read Slow Productivity by Cal Newport, maybe it's that you create office hours. So maybe you do, if you're working 3 days at home, 2 days in the office, maybe you do 1 day where you have office hours in person, you record it. And then you have an office hours where you do that when you're working remotely as well too, also recorded obviously because you're working remotely. And what that does is it builds out a database of information that you can then repurpose into knowledge management resource with all of the tools we have these days to actually separate out recordings, use AI to identify key takeaways and summaries. It's a really great way to document the intellectual property that each individual actually has. So that's a way that you could actually try to balance out some of the work. That's just an example of a subject matter expert who's constantly consulted, so much so that it's impacting their work time. I would have done that if the technology had been available to me like 5 years ago. I would totally have done that. And I think that would have been beneficial to the company, because when I walked away, none of that information was documented. I don't even remember it anymore. It's gone. It's in the ether. It's just a loss. It's 16 years of experience that just disappeared because I walked away. So start documenting why your people overwork. It may be that you're not even paying them overtime for it because it's onerous. You've got a lot of friction around how they actually bill for overtime. So it may be that they're not even telling you that they're overworking, but you can see the signs, right? So you can see emails sent at different times during the day that are not core hours. Pay attention, because you honestly have access to, like, when they log in, usually when they log out, when they are sending their emails, when they're actually using the systems. A lot of that data is already tracked and used for various different purposes. Why not use that data to really proactively work with people to craft their jobs? So job crafting is really an effective way of highlighting people's strengths and creating optimization for the work that gets done. And that's where I think the opportunity is, right? It's not so much that the legislation is the magic. It's taking a look at the workload and the overwork, at the reasons why people don't feel safe to leave work until the next day. What is it that is so urgent that they feel they have to respond immediately? How is instant messaging used in your company? How is email used in your company? Do people use delayed send? I had a discussion on the internet once with a woman who I was talking about just delayed sends and how it was courteous. If you wanted to work on the weekend, you could totally do that, but use the delayed send so you weren't interrupting other people's weekends and expecting them to respond. And she absolutely hated that idea, because the reason wasn't that she was working on the weekend so much because she had to. It was because she wanted to actually make an impression to other people in senior management that she was the hardest worker out there and therefore deserving of a promotion. So it was all performance art in a way. And it was an agenda that was actually unrelated to the workload. So this is why I'm saying you want to understand what the triggers are that people actually do this work outside of regular business hours, because not everybody has got the same triggers. And that's where the opportunity is, right? Because if one person is doing that, means that other people might be doing it as well too, and you don't even realize, right? How do you change the systems that are in place and you start to improve it for everyone? That's really where the opportunity is. And therefore, if the legislation ever does come, as a company, you now have something proactive in place that allows you to really not have to worry about the legislation, because you've already proactively made the changes that are triggering this overwork. And it's beneficial for engagement. It's beneficial for employees understanding that you're listening to them and practically paying attention to them and protecting them from things that are likely to burn them out over time if it continues. It's a way of designing for belonging and inclusion, and really paying attention to the employee experience. And so it will eventually, if you're being thoughtful and intentional about this across the board, improve the employer brand. You don't want it to just be pockets of the organization. It's best that if, honestly, all of the company is really committed to that. And I know this to be true because the one division that I left after that accident, they had you had to send emails within 24 hours. You had to respond to all emails within 24 hours. When I moved to the other division, responding that quickly actually caused problems. It was more like a 72-hour, 1 week turnaround time, because if you didn't actually take that long, it made everybody else look bad because they were taking too long. And it was more about the perception of how you were actually getting information and how information was processed in the division. And personally, I thought 24-hour turnaround was better for customers, but it was a lot more relaxing. It was a lot less stressful, and it allowed a lot of the workload difference between the two divisions was incredibly insane. Like, it really was significantly different just because of the difference in turnaround time in terms of the email expectation. And that was internal and external. And having pockets of the organization work differently actually can create different employee experiences across the board, and that's unfair. You may want to actually consider how that functions. And there could be strategic reasons for it. In the one division I was working for, it was all based on the stock market. And if you were taking longer than a day to actually get an answer, it would impact the price that somebody was actually getting when they sold their mutual funds or bought mutual funds. And that was the reason for the 24-hour turnaround, because it was all tied to the stock market. So there are regulatory reasons that you might have to accomplish. But at least if there's a clear understanding of that and an ability to adjust their workload that's not impacted by all things tied to the stock market, then that's an effort to be fair and to recognize that not everything you do actually has to require a 24-hour turnaround time. How can you establish norms and customs and how people do their jobs so that they understand what needs to be done and they're accountable for that type of turnaround time? How can you make that more fair across the board and recognize that recognize when workloads are going to go off the rails, right? There might be seasons and periods of the year where things get busier and not, and how do you staff for that appropriately, and how can you adjust expectations to account for volumes that are outside anybody's control. Those are all ways that you can then avoid the working after hours and people reaching out to each other inappropriately and interrupting personal time, where people feel that they're constantly connected, which is detrimental to their mental health. If you're doing all of this proactively, you don't actually need the legislation, because you've embraced the spirit of the legislation, which is recognizing that work is not the be-all and end-all. People do have lives outside of work, and unless you're actually getting paid to be on call, you should not be answering calls or writing emails at like midnight, for example, unless like your job is specifically designed to accommodate that. A lot of this comes back to the job description, the job design, the expectations, the company norms, and compensation, to be quite honest. Usually on-call compensation means that you're getting paid more for that privilege. So many people are actually doing that type of work. I was, and I wasn't being compensated for that appropriately, because it was considered overtime, and overtime had to be approved in advance. But the reason had to be something that was transitory. It couldn't be because, hi, my workload is so bad, and you've refused to adjust my client load. That was the reason. And I proactively campaigned to have my workload adjusted, and it would get adjusted, and then I would get more, and it would just spiral. So they would adjust it, but then give it back to you. And so that's where you proactively wanted to stay on top of what everybody's workload looks like. How does this change when you factor in different technology? So how does AI impact the way that we work? This is all something that's going to really change and morph and be adjusted over the next few years as well too. And hopefully it means that you're spending more time on the work that you do intrinsically, the work that doesn't feel like work. And so you can get the AI to do the grunt work that is boring, that is repetitive, that is necessary, but not engaging. And ideally you are redesigning the work and personalizing it so that you're maximizing people's strengths, so that they're working optimally because they enjoy the work and it's really fueling their passion and their purpose. That's what I hope. That's my optimism coming out, that we can redesign work in such a way that people aren't going to need the right to disconnect legislation, because we've recognized that it's not in the best interest of either employees or the organizations to have staff that are burned out and constantly engaged and answering emails and phone calls and whatever else on an ongoing basis without any break. That's my optimism. That's my hope for the future. So anyways, that's what I wanted to talk about. Always happy to hear what you have to say. Please rate, review, comment. Good Pods allows you to do that all. But you can also do it in Apple, Spotify, any player that you really use. Ratings, reviews are really helpful. Comments are always interesting. I'll share it on social, and I'm interested in having conversations about how you perceive this to work as well. So look forward to hearing from you. And please share. Thanks. Talk later.